They left her in the snow to die, but the Alpha King of Frostmir was the one who found her in the storm. If you love dark fantasy romance, forbidden bonds, and powerful Alpha Kings with slow burn tension, subscribe now and step carefully into the frozen kingdom, because this story is about to change everything. She didn't scream when they threw her into the snowstorm. That was the part nobody talked about later, not when the story spread through the frozen kingdom like frost climbing old stone walls. She didn't beg, didn't claw at the hands gripping her arms, didn't make a single sound as the cold swallowed her whole. Maybe she already knew screaming wouldn't change anything. The night was brutal, the kind of northern cold that didn't simply bite, it consumed. And the pack that had once called itself her family watched from the tree line without hesitation in their eyes. There was no goodbye, no regret. Just boots crunching back through the snow while Evelyn collapsed alone beneath the storm. Her thin medieval dress was already soaked through, rough linen clinging to her skin like frozen water. Her fingers went numb before she even thought to reach for something to hold on to. The mountains of the north didn't care about innocence. Tonight, they didn't care about her either. The accusation came fast. Too fast. One moment Evelyn had been standing beside the healer's table with herb stains still covering her fingers, and the next, the elder's voice tore through the great hall like a blade. She betrayed us. 3 words. That was all it took. The whispers spread instantly, while warriors who once trusted her suddenly refused to meet her eyes. Women she had cared for during harsh winters pulled their children closer the moment she looked their way. Evelyn searched the hall desperately, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak for her. Nobody did. Not one voice. The elder simply nodded once, and 2 warriors stepped forward without hesitation. One grabbed her arm while the other pushed her toward the gates, as if she had already stopped being human long before tonight began. "Leave her at the border," the elder ordered coldly. "The storm will finish what fate already decided." None of them looked back. The blizzard grew violent after midnight. Evelyn tried to walk at first because movement meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. But the northern wind slammed against her chest like something alive, cruel enough to enjoy watching her struggle. Her dress tangled around her legs with every gust, while sharp ice cut against her face hard enough to burn. Somewhere along the ridge she lost one of her shoes, but she barely felt it happen. That frightened her more than the cold itself. She stumbled once, then twice. By the 4th fall, her knees stopped wanting to straighten again. The frozen kingdom stretched endlessly around her, raw, indifferent, endless white swallowing everything whole. She pressed trembling fingers into the snow while pale clouds of breath escaped weakly from her lips. The cold had moved beyond painful now. It felt strangely gentle, seductive almost, like the storm itself was whispering that resting would be easier than fighting. Her eyes slowly drifted shut as one final thought crossed her mind. So this is how it ends. Not with fire, not with a fight, just snow. She had spent years caring for people who abandoned her in a single night. Evelyn had tended wounded warriors after border skirmishes, stayed beside feverish children until sunrise, and learned every healing herb growing within miles of their territory, because helping others was the only thing that had ever made her feel useful. None of it mattered now. She pressed her palm weakly against the frozen ground, while snow gathered slowly across her body like the beginning of a grave. "I gave you everything," she whispered into the storm, her voice barely stronger than the wind itself. No answer came back. That was the real wound, not the exile, not the blizzard, not even the fear of dying alone beneath the mountain cold. It was the quiet realization that she had spent years pouring warmth into people who would never have done the same for her. They had taken every gentle part of her without hesitation. And when the moment finally came to choose whether she was worth protecting, nobody chose her at all. The sound reached her first. Heavy footsteps moving slowly through the blizzard with the kind of controlled weight that didn't belong to anything small or harmless. Evelyn's eyes opened weakly before she even realized she was trying to move. Some ancient instinct, still buried beneath the hypothermia, suddenly came alive inside her chest with one sharp warning. Something is here. She couldn't feel her hands anymore, could barely breathe, but she heard it clearly now. Slow, powerful, unhurried footsteps moving through the snow as if the storm itself stepped aside to let them pass. Then the wind shifted around her, carrying a scent that cut straight through the frozen air. Pine smoke, leather, frost. Something darker beneath it all that instantly made every remaining nerve in her body tense. Evelyn blinked slowly as a massive figure finally emerged through the white darkness. Tall, broad, wrapped in black fur and battle-worn armor dark enough to swallow the moonlight whole. And even before she saw his face clearly, she felt his presence the same way someone feels heat from a distant fire long before seeing the flame itself. He crouched beside her without hesitation. No questions, no visible shock, just the clean, decisive movement of a man who had already made his decision before touching the snow. Up close, he looked even more dangerous than the stories whispered across the kingdoms. Thick black fur rested across broad shoulders armored in dark steel scarred from countless battles. Snow gathered along the edges of his cape, while amber eyes studied her silently beneath the storm. Burning, sharp, completely unreadable. "You're still breathing," he said at last. His voice was deep and controlled, carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to command fear. Evelyn swallowed painfully before whispering, "Barely." Something shifted briefly behind those amber eyes. Not amusement, not pity, something quieter than both. Then he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other beneath her knees before lifting her effortlessly against his chest like she was something worth carrying. Heat surrounded her instantly beneath the heavy fur cloak he wrapped around her trembling body. Real warmth. The first warmth she had felt all night. Her eyes fluttered weakly as exhaustion finally dragged her under. "Why are you doing this?" she breathed softly. Kaler held her closer against the storm before answering in a low voice near her ear. "I don't know yet." The blizzard howled around them while the Alpha King carried the rejected girl into the darkness of the north. And before unconsciousness finally claimed her completely, Evelyn heard his final words. Quiet, steady, certain. "You're not dying tonight." Somewhere beneath the armor, beneath years of silence and war, something inside the Alpha King had already begun to wake. Kaler didn't hunt out of necessity. He hunted because the night was the only place where he didn't have to be king. No court waiting for answers. No warriors watching every movement like it carried the fate of the frozen kingdom on its shoulders. Out here, deep in the northern mountains with the blizzard swallowing the world whole, he was simply the wolf. And the wolf answered to no one. He had taken the eastern route home like he always did after a long hunt, boots crushing through thick snow while icy wind scraped against the dark armor beneath his fur-lined cloak. The path was familiar. Every cliff edge, every shift in the mountain wind. Kaler knew these mountains better than he knew most people inside Frostmir. So when the scent reached him, he stopped instantly. Amber eyes narrowed against the storm as something unfamiliar drifted through the cold air. Not snow, not blood, not fear. Something softer beneath it all. Something alive. And for the first time that night, the wolf inside him went completely silent. He followed the scent before logic had the chance to stop him. That was the part Kaler would remember later. His feet moved first. Instinct before reason. 15 years ruling Frostmir had turned him into a man built on control, precision, and emotional distance sharp enough to cut through steel. He didn't involve himself in problems that weren't his responsibility. Didn't rescue strangers. Didn't make decisions without calculation behind them. Yet somehow, there he was, walking deeper into the blizzard towards something he couldn't explain. Earthen would have noticed immediately. "You never move without reason, my king," his second-in-command liked to say. Usually, he was right. Usually, Every choice Kaler made carried purpose. But tonight the storm pulled him forward, while the wolf stayed unnaturally alert beneath his skin. The scent grew stronger with every step. Pine smoke, snow, and something fragile buried beneath the cold that made the silence around him feel suddenly dangerous. He saw her before he reached her. A small shape half buried beneath the snow, dark medieval fabric barely visible against the endless white stretching across the mountainside. Kaler slowed automatically, instinct sharpening every movement as he approached. Not hesitation. Caution. The same kind a wolf used around something wounded enough to bite from fear alone. She lay motionless against the ice, pale hair scattered around her like frozen silk, while snow gathered slowly across her body. No signs of struggle nearby, no predator tracks, no broken cliffside suggesting an accident. Someone had left her here deliberately. Kaler stood still for only a moment before crouching beside her. The storm roared around them while he slid 2 fingers carefully beneath her jaw and turned her face toward him. And suddenly the cold inside him shifted into something darker. She was young. Too young to look this exhausted. Bruises darkened the side of her face, while angry marks circled one wrist, like something had restrained her long before the mountains finished the job. This wasn't fate. This was punishment. The wolf hated what it saw. Kaler felt it instantly, a sharp, restless tension moving beneath his ribs the moment he noticed the bruises beneath her skin. Not anger yet. Something older than anger. Something possessive. Dangerous. His jaw tightened beneath the storm, while snow collected across the dark fur resting on his shoulders. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly, though he already knew she couldn't answer. Her breathing was shallow, weak enough that another hour in this blizzard would have killed her completely. But then her lips moved slightly beneath the snow. One word, barely audible. "Please." The sound hit him harder than it should have. Kaler didn't save strangers. Frostmir knew that better than anyone. The Alpha King ruled with fairness, not mercy, because mercy made rulers weak, and weak rulers buried kingdoms. But this girl hadn't chosen whatever fate had dragged her into the mountains tonight. And before the thought even fully formed, he was already lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing against his armored chest. Kaler wrapped the heavy, fur cloak tightly around her frozen body with one practiced motion before turning back toward Frostmir without hesitation. Snow whipped violently around them while the storm clawed across the mountainside, but he barely noticed it anymore. His focus stayed on the fragile warmth still lingering beneath her skin. Earthen was going to have questions. The entire castle would. Bringing an unknown girl into Frostmir in the middle of the night wasn't a small thing, especially not for a king who avoided unnecessary complications like war itself. Let them question it later. Kaler adjusted his hold slightly as he continued down the mountain path, boots steady against thick snow while the wind screamed around them. She still hadn't opened her eyes, but halfway down the ridge, her trembling fingers slowly curled against the front of his armor. Small, weak, instinctive. Kaler glanced downward automatically, amber eyes lingering on her hand a moment longer than necessary. He didn't stop walking, didn't say anything. But something inside him tightened anyway. The castle lights finally appeared through the blizzard below them, distant amber flames glowing softly against the white darkness of Frostmir. Evelyn remained unconscious in his arms, her breathing shallow but steady beneath the warmth of his cloak. Kaler looked down at her face one last time while snow drifted across loose strands of pale hair. Someone from the north had thrown this girl into the mountains like she was nothing. The thought settled heavily inside him while the wolf remained unnaturally awake beneath his skin. Then another realization followed close behind it, more dangerous than the first. The wolf recognized her before I did. Kaler had trusted those instincts his entire life. They had kept him alive through war, betrayal, and bloodshed across the frozen kingdom. The wolf rarely chose wrong, which meant whatever he felt now wasn't random. And that was exactly the problem. Frostmir wasn't ready for complications like this. Neither was he. The wind howled across the cliffs, while the Alpha King carried the rejected girl through the gates of his kingdom, unaware that the storm waiting inside the castle walls would become far more dangerous than the one outside. Evelyn woke to a ceiling she didn't recognize. Dark stone stretched high above her, while firelight moved slowly across the vaulted arches in soft waves of gold and orange. For one disoriented second, she thought she was still trapped somewhere between the storm and unconsciousness, still caught inside that strange warmth that had felt almost like arms around her. Then the pain arrived. Sharp, immediate. Her fingers burned first, then her feet, then the bruised side of her face as feeling returned all at once. Thawing, she realized quickly, was far crueler than freezing. A quiet sound almost escaped her throat before she forced it back down. Heavy furs covered her body while flames crackled inside a hearth large enough to stand inside. And across the room, leaning silently against the stone wall with his arms crossed over dark armor, stood the man from the snow. Kayla watched her without moving. Those amber eyes remained steady when she looked at him, unreadable beneath the flickering firelight. "You're in Frostmir," he said finally. "Not welcome. Not you're safe. Just the truth." Evelyn swallowed slowly before answering, "I figured." Something shifted slightly in his jaw. Almost a reaction. Then it disappeared. She was given a room in the east wing, small compared to the rest of the castle, but warmer than anywhere she had slept in years. Thick blankets covered the narrow bed, while folded clothes waited quietly at the foot of it, dark wool dresses meant for survival, not beauty. Evelyn put one on without complaint. By the time she stepped into the corridor later that morning, the castle had already learned about her. Conversations died the moment she walked past. Warriors, standing near the stairwell, tracked her movements with slow, measuring eyes while servants lowered their voices behind her back. No one stopped her. No one welcomed her either. The silence inside Frostmir felt different from the silence she had known before. Colder somehow, more disciplined, like the frozen kingdom itself was watching to see whether she belonged inside its walls. Evelyn kept her chin level as she moved through the corridor, refusing to let herself shrink beneath the weight of their suspicion. She had learned long ago that flinching only encouraged cruel people to look closer. Still, somewhere deep inside her chest, the same quiet thought returned like an old scar reopening. Rejected girl. Still unwanted. Just in a different kingdom now. By the second day, the rumors had already reached the kitchens. Evelyn heard them while helping one of the servants carry a heavy basin across the lower corridor. They say she came from the Eastern Pax. They say she was exiled. They say the Alpha King carried her through the storm himself. That last whisper made the servant beside her glance sideways nervously before quickly looking away again. Evelyn said nothing. She simply lowered the basin carefully onto the wooden counter and moved on as though the words hadn't reached her at all. She already knew how stories like this ended for women like her. Frostmir tolerated her presence the same way a body tolerated a wound, technically alive, but never fully accepted. Later that afternoon, she found an elderly servant struggling with an armful of firewood near the rear hall. Without speaking, Evelyn stepped forward and took half the load from her hands. The old woman blinked in surprise. "You don't need to do that, girl." Evelyn adjusted the wood against her arms before answering quietly, "I know. Where does it go?" Something softened briefly in the woman's face as they continued down the corridor together. Kaler saw the entire thing from the upper corridor. He hadn't been looking for her. At least, that was what he told himself when his steps suddenly stopped beside the stone archway overlooking the lower hall. Below him, Evelyn stacked firewood beside the elderly servant while loose strands of pale hair slipped around her face beneath the warm torchlight. Dust covered the hem of her dark dress, and there was still a fading bruise visible near her jaw. She said something low enough that Kaler couldn't hear the words, but the old servant laughed softly in response. A real laugh, warm and unexpected inside a castle better known for silence than comfort. Kayla remained still a moment longer than necessary. The girl moved carefully, subtly favoring one side of her body, like someone accustomed to hiding pain instead of asking for help. The wolf noticed before he did. She survived this before. The thought settled heavily inside him, while his amber eyes followed the quiet way she carried burdens no one had asked her to carry. Kayla finally turned away and continued down the corridor. But the image stayed with him far longer than the border reports, waiting inside the war room. 3 days after arriving in Frostmir, Evelyn discovered the library. Hidden behind the great hall beneath layers of old stone and dust-covered corridors, it felt more like a secret than a room. She only found it because she had been searching for somewhere the warriors didn't constantly watch her breathe. The moment she stepped inside, silence wrapped around her differently there. Softer, warmer. Rows of ancient books stretched toward the ceiling while snow drifted quietly beyond the narrow windows overlooking the frozen kingdom below. Evelyn chose a book at random before sitting cross-legged beside the hearth, allowing herself, for the first time since the storm, to feel still. 2 hours later, the door opened quietly behind her. Kayla stopped the moment he saw her sitting there. Evelyn looked up slowly from the book in her lap. Neither spoke at first. "This room isn't forbidden, is it?" she asked carefully. Not defensive, just cautious. Kayla held her gaze, a second longer than necessary before answering, "No, I built it." Evelyn nodded once. "Then I'll leave if you want me to." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, the Alpha King crossed the room, selected a book from the shelf near the fireplace, and sat down opposite her without another word. The fire crackled softly between them while snow fell outside the tall windows. Neither spoke again that night. Somehow, the silence no longer felt empty. It was the 4th night when Berthan finally said aloud what the entire castle had been whispering since Evelyn arrived. The 2 men stood inside the war room while winter wind pressed softly against the tall windows overlooking Frostmir. "The warriors are asking questions," Berthan said carefully. Kayla barely looked up from the map spread across the table. "Let them ask." Berthan remained silent for a moment before continuing. "She's a rejected girl from an eastern pack. No alliance, no family name, no bond. Keeping her here creates problems." Kayla's jaw tightened slightly beneath the firelight. "She stays." The words came out calm, final. The kind of voice that ended arguments before they fully formed. Berthan studied him carefully then, watching the Alpha King with the attention of someone who had known him long enough to recognize dangerous silences. But he didn't push further. After the door finally closed behind him, Kayla remained alone beside the window overlooking the snow-covered castle grounds. Somewhere in the east wing, one small light still burned against the darkness. His amber eyes lingered there longer than they should have. He told himself it meant nothing. The wolf beneath his skin stayed completely silent this time. Somehow, that unsettled him even more. It started with small things. The way Evelyn moved through Frostmir before sunrise while the castle still slept beneath the weight of winter. Quiet footsteps through long stone corridors. Soft hands returning books carefully to their shelves inside the library. The way she thanked servants by looking directly at them, as though they were people worth noticing instead of shadows carrying trays through the halls. Kayla noticed all of it. Not intentionally. At least, that was what he kept telling himself. But Frostmir belonged to him. Every corridor, every torchlit archway, every shadow hidden beneath the frozen stone walls. And somehow Evelyn moved through the castle like something that didn't belong to the cold at all. Like warmth that had wandered into the wrong kingdom and simply refused to leave. Kayla found himself taking the east corridor more often than the west, pausing outside the library longer than necessary, listening for footsteps he had no reason to recognize so quickly. Every time, he invented a different explanation for it. The wolf beneath his skin never bothered pretending. On the fifth morning, he watched her train. Not intentionally. He had been reviewing patrol routes with Berthan from the upper walkway when movement in the courtyard below caught his attention. Evelyn stood alone beside the wooden training posts, dressed in borrowed sparring clothes, far too large for her frame, pale hair tied loosely back with dark cloth. Berthan continued speaking about border patrols while Kayler's focus drifted elsewhere completely. She wasn't skilled by Frostmir standards. Not even close. But she kept getting back up. Every strike against the training post jolted through her arms hard enough to stagger her backward, yet she reset her footing each time without frustration crossing her face. Quiet determination. That was somehow worse. Worse than pride. Worse than arrogance. Kayler watched her wipe blood from split knuckles against the side of her trousers before trying again. "My king." Berthan's voice finally pulled him back. Kayler blinked once before answering without looking away from the courtyard. "Continue." But even as Berthan resumed speaking, his amber eyes dropped back toward Evelyn one more time. She had fallen again. And once again, she stood back up. The evenings became dangerous in quieter ways. Especially the library. Especially the firelight. Without either of them acknowledging it aloud, the room slowly became something shared between them. Evelyn arrived after dinner, carrying whatever book she'd chosen for the night, and Kayler usually appeared sometime later beneath the excuse of unfinished reports or strategy maps he rarely touched once he sat down. Some nights passed entirely in silence, while snow drifted softly beyond the tall windows overlooking the frozen kingdom. Other nights, small conversations slipped unexpectedly between pages and firelight. "You don't sleep much," Evelyn said one evening without looking up from her book. Kayler turned a page slowly before answering, "Neither do you." A brief silence settled between them. "The cold keeps me awake sometimes," she admitted quietly. Kayler studied her over the edge of the book in his hands. The bruise near her jaw had almost faded now beneath the warm glow of the fire. "There are heavier furs in the east storage room," he said after a moment. "Third corridor." Evelyn finally looked up at him then. "You just know that." A faint shift touched the corner of his mouth, barely noticeable. "I know everything in this castle." She held his gaze for a second longer than usual before lowering her eyes back to the page. "Thank you," she whispered softly. Kayler didn't answer. But he didn't read another word for a long time either. The slow burn of it unsettled him more than any battle ever had. It wasn't one moment. Not a sudden collision or dramatic realization. Just accumulation. Quiet day after quiet day, each one leaving something behind inside him he hadn't agreed to carry. The sound of Evelyn laughing unexpectedly beside the old servant in the lower corridor. The way she stepped calmly between a frightened stable boy and an irritated warrior raising his voice too loudly. She hadn't challenged the warrior directly. Hadn't needed to. She simply placed herself there like a shield without thinking twice about it. And somehow, the warrior backed away first. Kayler had watched the entire thing from across the courtyard while snow drifted silently between them. The wolf reacted instantly, that same quiet, dangerous feeling settling beneath his ribs like something ancient recognizing its place after being lost too long. "Stop," Kayler warned silently. The wolf ignored him completely. That frightened him more than he cared to admit. Evelyn found him on the north battlement on the seventh night. Kayler rarely missed approaching footsteps, which made the fact that she reached his side unnoticed strangely unsettling. She stopped beside him without speaking at first, both of them staring out over Frostmir while moonlight spilled across the endless white valley below. Snow-covered forests stretched toward distant mountains, swallowed by low clouds, while icy wind moved quietly around the stone battlements. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. Kayler kept his eyes forward. "You can ask." Evelyn hesitated briefly before speaking again. "Why do you come up here?" Silence lingered between them long enough that she almost thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally, in that same calm voice that always sounded too controlled, he said, "Because it's the only place where the kingdom feels small." Evelyn turned slowly toward him. Kaler still didn't look back at her, but he felt her gaze immediately. Warm. Steady. Impossible to ignore. "That's a lonely answer," she said softly. Kaler's jaw tightened slightly against the cold wind. "Yes. Just one word. No deflection. No armor wrapped around it." Somehow, that honesty felt more intimate than anything else they had shared so far. They remained there together for a long time without speaking again. The wind softened around the battlements, while distant storm clouds gathered slowly beyond the mountains like something waiting patiently in the dark. Evelyn rested one hand lightly against the cold stone wall beside Kaler, close enough to feel the warmth still lingering where his arm had been moments earlier. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt dangerous instead, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say aloud. Eventually Kaler stepped away first. No explanation, no goodnight. Just the sound of heavy boots disappearing down the stone stairs beneath the tower. Evelyn stayed behind alone beneath the moonlight, breathing slowly while the frozen kingdom stretched endlessly below her. "Don't," she warned herself quietly. She knew exactly what this feeling was. The slow pull toward something forbidden. Something powerful enough to survive logic, fear, and every reason she should walk away before it became impossible to leave. She had survived exile, survived the storm, survived being abandoned by everyone she trusted. But as she watched a single light moving through the distant castle corridor below, her heart betrayed her completely by wanting something far more dangerous than survival. They arrived on a gray morning, while soft snow drifted quietly over Frostmir, and most of the frozen kingdom was still half asleep beneath the weight of winter. 7 wolves rode through the gates wearing eastern markings across heavy cloaks, weapons displayed openly at their sides without the slightest attempt to hide them. Evelyn heard the gates before she saw them, the deep groan of iron, followed by sharp voices echoing across the outer yard. She stood above the great hall when movement below caught her attention through the narrow stone window. And instantly her body went still. The man leading the group wore the same grey cloak, the same carved staff, the same cold expression he carried every time he destroyed someone's life and called it justice afterward. The elder. Evelyn's hand tightened slowly around the window ledge beneath her fingers. "They found me." The thought arrived quietly. No panic, no surprise. Just the heavy certainty of something inevitable finally reaching her again. Somewhere beneath every quiet evening, beside the library fire and every careful conversation shared on Frostmir's battlements, she had always known the past didn't stay buried beneath the snow forever. It always came back eventually. Kaler was already waiting inside the great hall when Evelyn descended the stairs. He stood at the center of the stone floor dressed in full armor, thick black fur resting heavily across broad shoulders while amber eyes fixed on the elder with the kind of silence more threatening than most men's rage. Burthen stood 2 steps behind him while Frostmir warriors lined the walls beneath burning torches. The elder spoke before Evelyn reached the bottom step. "We've come for the girl." His voice echoed sharply across the hall. "She belongs to us." Kaler didn't move. "She's standing in my hall," he replied calmly, "which makes her my concern." The elder's mouth tightened. "She was cast out lawfully. I didn't ask about your laws." Silence crashed across the room after that, heavy, sharp. Evelyn stepped fully into the hall while every eye turned toward her at once. She kept walking anyway, spine straight, chin lifted, dark dress brushing softly against the stone floor beneath her feet. The elder looked at her the same way people looked at storms before shutting the doors against them. "Evelyn," he said coldly, like he still expected obedience. "Elder," she answered evenly. And for the first time since entering Frostmir, she realized she was no longer afraid of him at all. "You were accused of betraying your pack. The elder continued loudly enough for every warrior in Frostmir to hear him clearly. Your exile was lawful, your punishment deserved. Evelyn held his gaze steadily. By whom? She asked. The elder frowned. By the council. By... Name one thing I actually did. The hall went silent instantly. Even the fire seemed quieter after that. The elder's jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath his beard. You know exactly what you did. Evelyn took another slow step forward. No, she said calmly. I know what you accused me of doing. Those aren't the same thing. A low murmur moved along the Frostmir warriors lining the walls while the elder's expression darkened visibly. He shifted his attention toward Kayla instead. The rejected girl has no standing in your court, Alpha King. No bond, no rank, no right to remain here. Kayla's amber eyes never left him. She has standing because I say she does. His voice stayed calm, controlled. Far more dangerous that way. And you'll lower your voice in my hall. Not a threat, not anger. Just absolute authority delivered cold enough to freeze the room around it. The elder stopped moving immediately. It was the younger wolf who made the mistake. Tall, broad, arrogant, in the careless way cruel men often were when nobody had ever truly challenged them before. He had been staring at Evelyn from the moment she entered the hall, but not with hatred. With possession. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, while the elder continued speaking behind him. Come on, the wolf said, already reaching for her arm. We're done here. His hand closed around her wrist. Evelyn didn't flinch. But the room changed instantly. The fire inside the great hearth stuttered violently, while every Frostmir warrior along the walls took one silent step forward without waiting for orders. Kayla moved. Not fast. Instant. One moment he stood across the hall. The next, his gauntleted hand had locked around the younger wolf's wrist with crushing force. The wolf looked up sharply and froze. Whatever he saw inside those amber eyes drained every trace of confidence from his face in seconds. Take your hand off her, Kayla said quietly. His voice sounded almost calm. That made it worse. She belongs to our pack. The grip tightened hard enough to force a sharp sound from the wolf's throat. Kayla stepped closer then, towering over him beneath black fur and scarred armor. She, he said slowly, is under my protection. The words landed across the hall like a blade striking stone. The younger wolf released Evelyn immediately. Kayla let go a second later, though the threat lingering beneath his silence remained sharp enough to cut through the entire room. The wolf stumbled backward 2 full steps without meaning to, instinct responding faster than pride. Evelyn still didn't look directly at Kayla, but she felt him beside her, solid, immovable, standing just behind her shoulder like a wall between her and everyone in that hall who had once tried to reduce her into something small and disposable. The elder slowly gathered what remained of his dignity while anger flickered visibly beneath his expression. This isn't finished, he warned coldly. Kayla barely reacted. It is for today. His amber eyes remained fixed on the elder with terrifying calm. You'll be escorted back to the border before nightfall, and if any of your wolves return to Frostmir without invitation, the Alpha Protector of this kingdom will meet you personally at the gates. A brief pause followed before Kayla added quietly, and I won't be in a diplomatic mood. The elder held Evelyn's gaze one final time before turning away. This time, she didn't lower her eyes for him, didn't blink, didn't give him a single piece of fear to carry home. Eventually he turned and walked away, his wolves following close behind him. The great hall exhaled slowly once the doors finally closed. Silence settled over Frostmir again, while the warriors slowly dispersed across the hall. Burthen spoke quietly to the guards near the doors before disappearing down one of the western corridors, leaving only Evelyn and Kayla standing near the firelight beneath the towering stone arches. Snow drifted softly beyond the high windows, while morning light spilled pale silver across the floor between them. Evelyn finally looked up at him fully. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Kayla's expression didn't change. "I know." A faint breath left her lips. "I could have handled it." "I know that too." Evelyn studied him carefully then. The unreadable amber eyes, the sharp line of his jaw, the heavy fur cape still draped across broad shoulders like armor layered over armor. "Then why?" she asked softly. Kayla held her gaze longer than usual before answering. "Because no one stands alone in my hall." The words settled somewhere deep inside her chest before she could stop them. Honest, simple, real. More honest than anything he had ever said to her before. Evelyn didn't answer right away. But something small shifted visibly in her expression, something fragile and unguarded that Kayla noticed immediately. He stayed perfectly still, as though moving too quickly might scare it away. Finally, the Alpha King stepped back and turned toward the corridor without another word, every movement calm and controlled once again. But as Evelyn watched him walk away through the firelit hall, she noticed something for the first time since arriving in Frostmir. This time, he looked back too. The winter moon came only once each year, and in Frostmir, it was the single night when the entire frozen kingdom stood still beneath the sky. No patrols crossed the outer walls. No warriors argued over border reports inside the war room. Even the training yards rested in silence beneath the falling snow. The entire pack gathered in the great courtyard, while the enormous pale moon hung above the mountains like something ancient watching from beyond the clouds. Snow reflected its light until the kingdom itself seemed to glow silver from within. Evelyn had been told to remain in her room during the ritual. Not by Kayla, by Berthan, calm, respectful, careful in the way people became when delivering instructions they knew wouldn't be welcomed. "The ritual is for the pack," he had explained quietly. "It may not be appropriate for the stranger." Evelyn finished for him. Berthan hadn't denied it. She sat alone in her room afterward for exactly 4 minutes before standing again and walking toward the narrow window overlooking the courtyard below. And there, at the front of Frostmir beneath the winter moon, stood Kayla in full armor with black fur draped across broad shoulders like darkness carved into human form. The ritual began with silence. That was the part that unsettled Evelyn most. Not the torches burning across the courtyard. Not the formation of wolves standing beneath the moonlight. The silence itself. Hundreds of people standing perfectly still beneath the open sky as cold wind moved softly around them all. Something ancient lived inside that silence. Something older than kingdoms and borders and titles. Evelyn rested one hand lightly against the frozen glass while Kayla finally began to speak below. His voice carried naturally through the winter air, low, calm, impossible to ignore. She couldn't hear every word from her place above the courtyard, but certain phrases reached her clearly through the cold. "Those who stand beneath this moon are not here by accident. Frostmir does not choose lightly. And what this kingdom claims, it keeps." Evelyn slowly stepped back from the window, intending to leave before anyone noticed her watching. But then Kayla stopped speaking and looked directly upward, straight toward her window. The entire courtyard shifted instantly as wolves followed the Alpha King's gaze into the east wing shadows, where the so-called stranger stood frozen behind the glass. Kayla held Evelyn's gaze for one long moment before turning back toward the gathered pack below him. "There is one more thing," he said calmly. The courtyard fell even quieter somehow. Berthan shifted slightly behind him while snow drifted softly across the stone beneath their feet. 10 days ago, a girl was left to die in a snowstorm on the northern ridge. Kayla's voice remained steady, controlled. But every wolf in Frostmir listened now with complete attention. She was abandoned by her pack, cast into the cold as though her life carried no value at all. Silence tightened across the courtyard. Kayla looked briefly toward the east wing again before continuing. "She mattered then." A pause followed. "She matters now." His amber eyes darkened slightly beneath the moonlight. And from this night forward, she will not be called a stranger in this kingdom again. Something inside Evelyn's chest tightened painfully at the words. Not because they were loud, because they weren't. Kaler never needed volume to make the world shift around him. The door to Evelyn's room opened before she reached it. Berthen stood quietly in the doorway, one hand resting against the stone frame while snowlight spilled faintly behind him from the corridor windows. For a moment he simply looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not suspicion anymore. Something quieter than that. Respect, perhaps. Without speaking, he stepped aside. Evelyn followed him downstairs and out into the courtyard where the pack slowly parted before her as she crossed the snow-covered stone. Not the cold, wary distance she had felt during her first days in Frostmir. This was different. Slower. Intentional. Like everyone standing there understood they were witnessing something the kingdom would remember long after tonight ended. Evelyn finally stopped in front of Kaler beneath the winter moon. He looked down at her silently while silver light reflected across dark armor and amber eyes. "You could have told me," she said softly. "Before." Kaler's expression barely shifted. "I know." A faint breath escaped her lips. "You let me believe I was still the rejected girl." His gaze remained fixed on hers. "You were never that here." Something inside her cracked quietly at the honesty in his voice. "Why now?" she whispered. Kaler glanced briefly toward the moon above them. "Because the moon doesn't wait." His eyes returned to hers. "And I've already waited long enough." Kaler reached slowly beneath the heavy fold of his fur cloak before pulling out a dark iron circlet simple enough to seem almost severe beneath the moonlight. Not decorative. Not fragile. A crown made for the north. The moment the wolves surrounding them saw it, the entire courtyard went completely still again. Evelyn felt her breath catch softly in her chest. "Kaler, you don't owe me anything," he interrupted immediately. "Not for the ridge, not for the hall, not for any of it." His voice lowered slightly then, quieter beneath the winter moon. "I'm asking because Frostmir has been cold for a very long time, and I didn't understand how empty it had become until you walked into my library and sat beside the fire like you belonged there." Evelyn stared at him silently while emotion pressed painfully beneath her ribs. "You're the Alpha King," she said weakly. "Yes. And I arrived here with nothing." For the first time that night, something dangerously close to softness moved through his expression. "You arrived here," Kaler said quietly, and that was enough. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly toward the circlet in his hand. The snowstorm, the ridge, the library fire, the battlement. His voice in the dark. Somehow every moment had led here. Slowly, she lifted her chin again. "If I say yes," she said carefully, "I won't stay silent about things that are wrong." The faintest trace of amusement touched Kaler's face, barely visible. "I'd be disappointed if you did." The circlet settled against Evelyn's hair as though it had always belonged there. The wolves of Frostmir didn't cheer. Instead, something older rose from the gathered pack, a deep sound rolling through the courtyard like distant thunder beneath the winter moon. It climbed into the frozen night and disappeared across the mountains surrounding the kingdom. Kaler adjusted the circlet gently with one gloved hand, fingers brushing briefly against her temple while amber eyes remained fixed on hers. "My queen," he said quietly. "Not a title. A recognition." Evelyn felt the words settle somewhere far deeper than fear ever had. Around them, Frostmir stood silent, beneath the moonlight, while the slow burn of the last 10 days finally collapsed into something undeniable. The library fire, the quiet conversations, the battlements above the valley, the hand that reached for her in the snow without hesitation. All of it had become this moment. Evelyn didn't answer him with words. She simply held his gaze beneath the winter moon, without looking away. And the rejected girl left behind to disappear beneath the storm finally understood the truth that terrified her most. The snow had almost buried her forever. Instead, it had carried her home. She arrived in Frostmir with nothing, no title, no bond, no one waiting for her behind the gates of the frozen kingdom. Just a thin medieval dress soaked by snow, bruises hidden beneath pale skin, and the quiet kind of strength people only develop after surviving too many nights alone. She hadn't come searching for love, hadn't come searching for a king. She arrived barely breathing, carried through the storm in the arms of a man who had every reason to leave her there, and didn't. And somewhere between the library fire, the silent battlements, the winter moon, and all the moments neither of them knew how to name out loud, something impossible began to grow. Not a fairy tale. Something far more dangerous than that. Trust. The kind that asks people to be fully seen and stay anyway. Evelyn did not become the Luna Queen because Kaler placed a circlet on her head. She became queen the moment she refused to let the world turn her pain into shame. And the Alpha King who never saved anyone discovered, far too late to stop it, that the girl he carried out of the snow had slowly become the center of everything he no longer wanted to lose. And maybe that's why this story lingers long after the winter moon fades. Because beneath the fantasy, beneath the armor, and the frozen mountains, and the slow-burn tension, there's something painfully real inside it. The fear of not belonging anywhere. The ache of giving everything and still feeling unseen. The quiet hope that somewhere in this world there is still a place, or a person, capable of looking at us fully and saying stay. Evelyn found that answer in amber eyes, scarred armor, and a voice that promised she would never face the cold alone again. Maybe your story is still unfolding too, and if you believe the rejected can still become queens, that lonely kings can still learn how to love, and that some of the strongest bonds are born in silence, snow, and darkness, then stay close to Frostmir. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and come back for the next story waiting beneath the winter moon. Because somewhere out there, another Alpha King still hasn't realized he's about to meet the one person capable of changing everything.